Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Follow the Leader. I am just so excited. I am bringing to you from Missoula, Montana, poet and author Chris Latre. Welcome.
Bonjour. Thank you for having me.
Chris, I is so glad that you made time out of your busy schedule. Y'all, he travels talking about his poetry, talking about his three books, which we have here. First being One Sentence Journal, which got him the Montana Book Award in 2018 and the High Plains Book Award in 2019. Then your second book, which by the way, the spine on this, the binding with the string, nice, nice touch, very nice. This is also another one of the short form haikus. Um, remember- and then finally, Becoming Little Shell, a landless Indian's journey home. This is his memoir that now did this book itself or the books you previously wrote get you the Montana Poet Laureate Award?
It would be the first two because
The first two.
my term as poet laureate started a year before Becoming Little Shell came out.
Okay. Wow, that is really I didn't know that timeline. So how did that when we look at your books and folks, um, Chris primarily focuses, like he says, Becoming Little Shell, a landless Indian's journey home. He talks about the Chippewa, Métis, talks about the Little Shell. Can you inform or educate folks who may not know that history? Who are the Little Shell? What does that mean? And why did you feel called to write that book?
Well, I'll try and be brief. I could churn up the whole rest of this hour just talking about that. It's a almost a 200-year story, from when we were disenrolled essentially by the federal government, from what we would know today as the Turtle Mountain Chippewa in North Dakota. We were originally part of a larger group called the Pembina Chippewa, and Chief Little Shell, for whom we are named, was a hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa. And through all of the shenanigans of land theft that the United States has been dealing in for 500 years, began before the United States was technically even the United States. But, if we want to, since this is the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, let's just say 250 years. But, we were disenrolled and became a diaspora of people who were known as the Landless Indians. And over the next 150 plus years, multiple times we would send delegations to the United States government to, make an effort for us to be, restored to our original status, which is a sovereign nation. And that finally happened in December of 2019. So that is when the Little Shell was restored to this relationship with the United States government, which, for those people who don't understand, if you are recognized by the United States as a sovereign nation, then your interaction then is a government to government. Like, we have our own constitution, we can make our own laws. We exist as kind of a nation within a larger nation, that being the United States. So that stuff gets very complicated. But, like I said, between 150, 200 years, we didn't have any of that. Though the state of Montana, which is where we're based now in Great Falls, recognized us in the early 2000s as being a legitimate tribe. So it's been this big story, and that's kind of what Becoming Little Shell talks about, is how that happened and how the steps we went through to be restored.
Well, and you talk about how a lot of this was started by the passing of your father. I'm so sorry. And then, like you said, how that coincides with the Little Shell. Um, uh, I think they have the largest reservation. Like, it's an urban reservation. It's a different structure than in other places. Is that correct?
No, we don't have a
Because,
reservation, and
but
and we
I
never
mean,
and we never
urban.
will.
So there's no boundary, political boundary of
There
what
isn't.
now. Wow.
Mm-mm.
Okay.
So, the vast majority of indigenous people, Indians, regardless of tribe, are urban Indians. So it's a relatively small percentage of Native people who actually live on reservations. Most of us are
Wow.
urban. We live outside of the reservation. And in our case, all of us do, though many of us will live on other reservations. So there are Little Shell people living on the Blackfeet Reservation. There are Little Shell people living on the CSKT Reservation, Crow Reservation, Northern Cheyenne, you name it, Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, Rocky Boy, especially. The Rocky Boy, Chippewa Cree are part of that same diaspora from the Pembina Chippewa, or many of them are, that we come from, as are people who live, who are part of the Manitoba Métis Federation in Canada. So, we spread out all over. But yeah, we don't have one, and we never will.
Thank you for clarifying that. There was some discussion about, um, there's the Little Shell Community Center that's going in locally, and I was overhearing someone talk about, like, what do the structures look like for that? Because, like you said, it's a sovereign government. And, but again,
Yeah, we
totally
actually
makes
have
sense.
two. We have two community centers. One that we built on land that we own, just like as any other private landowner. We own a fair amount of land as private landowners. Now, when we received our federal restoration in 2019, we get 200 acres that can be turned into trust land, which is essentially very similar to how reservation land is held. It's
Yeah.
land held in trust by the federal government. Currently, we have to buy that land first. And there's a parcel that I think we're going to turn into trust land here soon. But, as in anything dealing with the feds and the BIA, it's a long and tedious bureaucratic process. So, we have one community center that was built, I think, like in 2012 or 13. And then we just opened another one behind this big warehouse that we built that's essentially like a food pantry type thing, where people can come and pick up food if you're, suffering from, food scarcity. Um, so there's that. And so, yeah, we have kind of almost a little campus of places things that we own, but it is not reservation land. It's just private land that we own.
Well, and it goes to show, A, like you were talking about the diaspora of all sorts of people on different reservations, but also the idea of being landless, needing to form a private group, buy back land. It it's dystopian. It is. Like, and
Absolutely.
it's enraging. Like, I mean, like, as you're talking about it, I can, um talk to me. What has been your involvement, or how was as you're learning what it means to be Little Shell, you're observing a lot of institutional collaboration. I don't even know. Collaboration's not the word. Engagement, I guess, because I don't know how many folks are all collaborating with one another. But like you said, you got the feds and the BIA. What was it like to go through these historical documents and see the way, like, in order to write this book, to see the way that the government has talked about Indigenous people versus the stories that you were also learning, through your research of your community?
Well, we can go back to the Declaration of Independence, which we're celebrating. And the Declaration of Independence describes Indigenous people as merciless Indian savages. So when those guys wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were using Native North Americans as a wedge issue to kind of claim that the English government was using us to stir up violence against these brave settlers who were trying to become the United States. So right from the founding document of our country, we are held as this thing that literally savages. And we had, a vast continent spanning network of sovereign nations and trade networks and all of these things that were far more sophisticated than until recently people were willing to give us credit for, and so right out of the gate, this relationship is antagonistic. And, that's kind of one of the things that I've kind of made my mission, at least for this year, is to kind of push back against this whole narrative that, oh, what a wonderful place this has been. And we have these 250 years to celebrate. As well, not all of us. For the vast amount of that time, if you weren't a white male, it really wasn't that great to be in the United States, So I think that, and that isn't to necessarily burst anybody's bubble. It's like, let's talk about the real history of who we are and where we come from. And by we, I mean the whole intertribal relationship of people from all over the world, as well as the people who were indigenous here since time immemorial, because we all have to live together, right? So that's what we need to be talking about. And we can't move into the future without accepting what has happened in the past. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat it as the story goes, right? So, we need to tell those stories, and the story of the little shell just happened to be the one that I was living. So of course that's the one that I was going to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and like you said, this 250 years of like, oh, it was all jolly and look, we just did all, and it's like, no, I mean, clearly, ooh, is it the 10 penny? No, 10 penny treaty? 10 cent
10-cent
treaty.
treaty. Yep. 10-cent treaty.
Yeah. The 10-cent treaty, the exploitation, the bait and switch. Like, folks, these are legal documents of the government. Like, you have a paper trail of bait and switch, corrupt, dishonest negotiations. Negotiations, not even the word either. When you talk about, I like the way, or I hadn't heard this, but the mighty Red River of the North. You spent a lot of time. What was it like being out in that part of the country? It's a very isolated part of the country. There's also like I said, not a ton of people, lots of nature, um, but also a lot of history of land sale and battles for a place where you look around and doesn't seem like it's a whole lot of nothing. Can you talk about doing the research for this book and going out into these places and getting your boots on the ground?
Yeah, I like to define it as the mighty Red River of the North, because there's an off-brand Red River to the south down in like a different part of the continent that I don't want anybody to make the mistake that that's where we come from. So our river, the mighty Red River of the North. So that is the border today of so-called Minnesota and North Dakota, and it flows north into Manitoba, through the city of Winnipeg, and drains into Lake Winnipeg, which ultimately drains into Hudson's Bay. So Winnipeg, Manitoba, the city, which is one of the largest cities in Canada now, is the original Red River settlement. So, when we talk about the Métis people, which the Little Shell are largely comprised of Métis people, that is where it all started, beginning in the late 1600s, is that region. And I so there were trips I made that don't necessarily show up much in the book, yet are foundational to the spirit of what the book is about. And, I know you're working on a book, and I know that you can probably relate to the idea that there are things that you have learned that may not land on the page, but the book would not be what it's going to be if you hadn't had those experiences. And it just becomes part of the spirit of this piece of effort that you're going to devote so much time and energy to. So, like trips I made out there, were pretty profound. And so, for example, and this was during my book tour, so it was even after the book came out, I got to visit the Red Lake Chippewa Reservation for the first time. And that was one of those times where I'm driving through, and it was a day kind of like we're having in the Missoula area today, where it's cloudy and rainy and just misty, and there was no one around. Like this is northern Minnesota, and there's no one around, and there's just these trees. And I passed this sign, entering the Red Lake Reservation. And it was one of those just profound moments of like, wow, this is where my people are from, more than any other place that I
Mm.
visited, but one of the things that I love, like I was invited to speak at a language conference in Belcourt, North Dakota, which is where the Turtle Mountain Reservation is headquartered. And there's a Little Shell street, and busts of Little Shell in these different places. And, going there and interacting with people who are kind of speaking this, mostly English, but peppered with Anishinaabemowin, which is
Mhm.
our Chippewa language, and Michif, which is the Métis language. Just this blend. I don't ever hear that here where I live, so going there and experiencing that was also just a profound, uh, kind of soulful opportunity.
Well, and speaking of soulful, like I said, this was prompted with you looking around at your father's funeral and learning this whole new side of your grandfather's funeral. Thank you. A whole new side of yourself that your wasn't communicated. This story is that when you wrestled with that. When did it become like, okay, this is just something I'm gonna do for myself, and to more like, no, this is something I'm advocating for. I'm fully behind this now. Can you talk about that transition?
Yeah. So the introduction to becoming Little Shell is the description of that funeral. I grew up, uh, like I can look out my window and I can see the remains of the paper mill in Frenchtown where my father worked for 43 years. So, I'm living now very close to where I grew up. And, my whole life, my father and my grandfather denied that we were native at all. But my grandmother made it very clear that we were Chippewa. And so I grew up and I took that, it's like, I'm Chippewa. I'm going to tell everybody I am. And even though I didn't know what it meant. So when I go to that funeral, my grandfather's funeral in 1996, and I show up and the church is full of Indians who we supposedly aren't related to. My dad had always said we weren't related to any of the other Latrays in Montana either, yet here are all these Latrays that I've never seen or heard of before who are clearly my relatives. That was really one of the first like major kind of bell ringing moments about, okay, here's this story that there's more to it than what dad and grandpa have been saying. But it's not until, over the next, like that planted the seed, but that seed didn't really bear any growth until 2013, when I meet Nicholas Vrooman, who wrote this book, The Whole Country Was One Robe, which is about the Little Shell. And there's a whole chapter in the book devoted to this interaction as well. And, I picked the book up and there's all these Latrays referenced in the index, and there's all these Donies, which is what my grandmother's side of the family, were. And, I meet Nicholas, and that's the first time I ever say out loud to anybody that I'm thinking of writing a book about who we are and my family and all that stuff. And he says, yeah, you have to. This is your story. You need to tell it. And so that's 2013 or whatever. And that was like that was like when the starting flag dropped, and I was off. And even though it was a slow process to really get the project going, that's kind of the ultimate kickoff point.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad you did. I'm so glad you listened to him, and I'm so glad you took this on because it's important. It's important to the Little Shell's history. It's important to Montana's history. I snidely think it's funny that forever, based on your books about poetry, but uh, your name and face will is forever
God,
the
literally,
state of Montana, and it doesn't
literally.
matter if the governor likes you or not. Your face and go, and I just think that's so like you went. It what a really cool journey,
Well,
and
we have to,
again, it all.
that was one of the things, because it was Governor Greg Gianforte who appointed me Montana State Poet Laureate. And it happened 5 years to the day when my first book came out, One Sentence Journal, August 14th, 2018 is when that came out. I'd never had any plan to be a poet or anything. But when that book came out, people started calling me one, and I was like, okay, I'll be one. I wanted to write a book of poetry at some time, but I figured that'd be way down the road. Gianforte then calls me August 14th, 2023, 5 years to the day of the book coming out, to say that he was appointing me poet laureate. And, I feel like that was kind of a political decision. It looks good for him to appoint an Indigenous person to this position. I don't have anything bad to say about Gianforte when it comes to his role in getting the Little Shell restored. He had to convince because he was our representative at the federal, he was our state representative at the time, and he got all of those people to buy into the legitimacy of who we are. So that's great. But now you look in the news today where he's like this huge anti-buffalo person, and he's the most difficult person to restore buffalo, and the decisions he's making related to like American Prairie's efforts to have a buffalo herd in central Montana. Buffalo belong there. Buffalo belong there more than anybody, more than we do. And so that to me is an indication of this guy doesn't really care about the reality of these relationships of this place that we live in, that we've only been here for just the tiniest fraction of time that the place has existed. That to me is important. And that to me shows his true colors. The fact that he doesn't want this land to be occupied by this magnificent Manitou spirit that has been here for thousands of years. So, it's one of those clashes of indigenous cultural view and worldview versus this, let's just burn it all down and worry about it, make it somebody else's problem in the future.
And that's exactly what it is. It's take now. We'll figure it out down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And the line is running out. I want to touch on, for those who may not understand, like you said, the bison or buffalo politics, the American prairie politics, which are going on. Like you said, they are native to Montana, to the region, to the Dakotas. Also, Eastern Montana, for those who are like, what goes on that side of the world? A whole lot of nothing but grasslands. But here's the thing, those grasslands, there's only 4 of them worldwide. There's like another one down in South America. There's another one in Australia. I want to say there's one in like Central Asia or
Yeah,
something,
like
these
Mongolia.
grasslands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry. Did you say bison or buffalo? I know that word, like, did you say
Well,
personally? Do you use? You tell me.
so that's funny. One time I was in Billings talking about buffalo, and
Mhm.
this woman down the hall who was over listening to our conversation said, actually, it's bison, because technically the American bison is the official name, but everybody calls it buffalo. And I turned to her and I said, well, actually, it's bijiki, because bijiki is the Anishinaabe word for our relatives. So I like to say bijiki, but when people don't know what that word is, I'll say buffalo 90% of the time, just because it's a cooler word,
Yeah.
especially if you drop the middle A and you pronounce it like it's BUFF''LO,
Buffalo.
buffalo,
Yeah.
buffalo. So
Yeah.
yes, that's what I call it.
Spoken like a writer, that whole response.
Right, right.
You're like, my
Language
allegiance isn't to
matters.
science. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
it's to language. But but yes, well, my point being, not they've been here for thousands of years. Cattle have not. Cattle, in
Correct.
terms of domesticated cow and what they do to those grasslands. Those grasslands are what holds all of it together. It's super boring, folks, but those roots go deep. They hold the topsoil together, and domesticated cattle will stomp on it over and over, and they keep contained. And so that's a major part of it from the environmental side. But please, can you tell us culturally also what the bison, buffalo, and Bajing, I'm sorry, Bajing,
Bijiki. Bijiki.
Bijiki. Can you tell us what their significance is to the Métis or Chippewa?
Well, to any of the indigenous people of the Northern Plains, we were all buffalo people. And, one of the kind of words you hear all the time in conservation circles is stewards of the land. And I hate that term, because steward still creates this hierarchy that says, well, human people are the top and we're the ones managing everything else. And if you look at historically the Northern Plains, the Central Plains, most of North America, Bijiki, buffalo, was the one, because you talked about that grassland and how that affects the ecosystem below ground of insects, and how those insects are key to plant survival as well as food to birds, and those birds are eaten by bigger birds, and the grass that is nourished by the passage of millions of hooves over thousands of years. All the fertility of the American breadbasket isn't there just because some white bearded old dude living in the sky said, we're going to make the Americans, the chosen ones. And here's this great place to grow food. No, it's there because of millions of hooves of buffalo turning it into the soil it is. And their, leavings behind as they pass. So, that relationship is deep, not just with humans, but with everybody else that shared this place, other predators. So that, like what American and Prairie is doing, and even the folks working for the national parks trying to create this, Yellowstone to the Yukon connections for our older than human relatives to be able to move back and forth like they always did. I think it's critical to our survival. And, I was at a writing conference last year in Crested Butte, Colorado, and there was a panel discussion, and the topic was the future of wildlife in the West. And I should have known better because the panel consisted of three white dudes and a white woman. And while they're all knowledgeable and great writers, excellent thinkers know this thing, the fact that you're going to have this conversation and not include at least one non-white person, particularly indigenous person, just shows that you're not really paying attention, because there is no future in the West without involvement of indigenous people. So I was already entering the conversation annoyed. And there was one guy who'd written a book about, I think it was grizzly bears, and he multiple occasions talked about the mythological relationship that native tribes had with some of these, apex animals, and, bears and wolves and buffalo and stuff. And I finally kind of erupted. I'd had enough and said, this is not a mythological relationship. This is a relationship that we still, live and die by. There's a reason why the buffalo is front and center on the little shell flag. It's because that relationship was the most important one to us. They fed us, they clothed us, they represent respect in the seven grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people, which is like our code for how we're supposed to live our lives. And buffalo is there. This is not a mythological relationship. It's a current and a relationship that has existed since time immemorial, right? And I hate when that's why it's important for us to be included in these conversations, because it's a different perspective.
Absolutely is. It absolutely is. Um, One of the things that you talk about is that you've talked about this the mytholo that phrase, the mythological relationship, which is really interesting because in another part of the book you talk about your relationship with Catholicism, not to be diminished to religious folks. I'm like, speaking of other mythological relationship, you talk about you had a relationship with you're employed in the tech world. You have a background in Catholicism from your mother, is what I recall, your mother's line. Um, can you talk about how this journey has expanded or changed your faith at all? What that looks like today?
I didn't have a faith. So the Catholicism comes from my father's side, actually,
Okay,
because the Métis people are deeply Catholic. And so, but my mom, kind of experimented with different churches, and, has spent time in the Catholic Church more as a place to go, I think, for a certain amount of spiritual comfort, not so much, I don't know if she's even baptized, to be honest with you. I was, because my grandparents, made it necessary that I was going to be baptized. But, when you're an infant, you don't really have a say in that. But to say, I wouldn't say I was an atheist, but I certainly wasn't Catholic, and I wasn't any, particular denomination. And today I would say that's my biggest struggle, because on the one hand, there are many people, not just in Little Shell Tribe, but in all of these Northern Plains tribes that I'm related to. Christianity still has their claws in, and a lot of people get a lot of, emotional comfort from their faith, and it's hard for me to say, yeah, you're wrong. So on the one hand, you have to let them, whatever it takes for them to survive, whatever they need to get through their day-to-day lives. I'm not going to judge people for that. But at the same time, I feel like that is also if not the most, it's certainly in the top tier of betrayal, because it's Catholicism primarily was like the bloody spear tip of colonialism. Those were the guys who came in and built schools and started taking children from families even before the boarding school era to re-educate them, to disconnect them from their indigenous heritage. And, for 100 years, the two kind of lived hand in hand and it was beautiful. But then the boarding schools happen and language and culture is literally beaten out of people, and all of the abuses that happened and all of the unmarked graves around these mission schools, it's profoundly evil. What was done to indigenous people by Catholicism, by Christianity, is the definition of evil in every possible way that you can imagine, except for what some things that people will cherry pick from their holy book to say, well, it's our right as Christians to make the world Christian, or whatever you want to say. So that's the struggle, is the people who continue to be Christian and need that to live their lives versus the reality of what that faith has done, not just to our tribe, but to tribes across the continent, around the world, really.
It is, and that's an interesting, you talk about it being a betrayal. You have the egregious, overwhelming, very in your face evil of the boarding schools. You also have forced sterilization
Hmm.
of women.
At the
I
same time,
talked
though, we have these folks. That's part of our intertribal relationship that we need to make peace with and be able to work together, because Christians aren't going anywhere. And I don't want to broad brush every Christian with the brand that thinks that our current president is in some way representative of their faith. I just don't get that. But there are plenty of people I know who are Christian, native and non-native, who I am happy to spend time with. And I have trust that they will hold up their end when the time comes for us to do whatever we need to do to ensure our future. So again, it's the complexity of the world we're in right now, of all these different ideas, and trying to make things work together. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
Oh, no, no, I mean, and that was a great point. I was just commenting on Christianity being used, you know, egregiously over time, which I didn't need to recount to you as you were saying, because, no, it's 2026, it's very much here. We're talking about holy wars again. We're talking
hmm
about conquest, like, this is it, and this idea that they're ever, the heritage, this is they're just owning it at this point. This is our heritage, this is who we are, we're Christians, and, it's not familiar to how I understand Jesus or how I was raised, um, but I also know that faith or spirituality, I often find it out in the mountains, out in nature. I love spending time with my dog. I love just going out on a good hike. And what I appreciate about you is in your poems, one sentence journal and descended from a travel worn satchel, which is a haiku. Um, you do such a beautiful job of talking about and capturing what it's like to be out in the Montana wilderness. Um, how has this time alone or with others hiking, and being out, how has that helped shape and give you time to process all of this insight and all of this research, all of these people, these stories? I mean, you're a storyteller, but you accumulate stories as too. Um, Talk about, what it's like to process some of these stories. Talk about, what it's like to spend time in nature and considering this. What is that like? I know that you're in Frenchtown, not Missoula specific. Do you appreciate being in a smaller town versus Missoula?
Well, absolutely. And I'm kind of like my address is technically a Missoula address, but the kids in my neighborhood go to Frenchtown. So as far as I'm concerned, it's Frenchtown. And it was Frenchtown when it
Right?
was
Yeah.
just a field to me when I was growing up. None of this was here. But yeah, absolutely. And there I read a statistic about for the vast amount of human history, we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, humans spent like 99.9% of their time outdoors because we didn't have houses like we have now and things like that. And now, in just this tiny little fraction of time that humans have been here, now we spend 93% of our time indoors. And of those, the 7% of time that we're not indoors, the majority of that time is spent moving from our cars to indoors. So like that 93% also includes being in our car. And then the majority of time of that we're not in one of those two places, we are moving from one to the other. So the point I'm making is that we are wired to be outside. And being outdoors and spending out time, going on hikes and just sitting by the river and all those things were part of me as long as I've been alive. And I think what was revealed to me is that, that our original instructions as indigenous people come from the land, and our creation story and the creation of the first human in the Anishinaabe creation story and the first task that first human is given is to go out in the world and pay attention to it and learn from all of these other relatives who are here first, how we're supposed to interact with each other to survive in this new place. And, growing up, not part of any community of elders or culture or anything, I realized that I was learning how to be Anishinaabe the way we did in the beginning, which was just spending time outside. And whenever I get in these stretches where I'm not doing enough to be out, whether it's hiking or just sitting, that's when I start to fall apart. So that I think has just even been magnified since I've been doing this, work of really thinking about what does it mean to be, up on top of a mountain? What does it mean just to be sitting on my porch in the morning with my coffee, paying attention to the birds and who's migrated back? And, I saw 25 sandhill cranes fly by me this morning that I would have knew were out there if I was just sitting in here doom scrolling or something, So it's critical to me. I think it's critical to many people, even who don't really realize it yet.
And as you were talking, I was realizing that so many of the folks who are outside but live in urban environments, their outside might be golf courses or very curated, refined outdoor spaces. And, that's what the resources that are around them. Not everyone gets to have Montana in their backyard. I
Hmm.
recognize that. But there is something to be said and learned from the realities of rugged nature, that we are not in control. It doesn't look fine and pretty and perfectly usable, um and that dangerous things can happen. Um and it's not there's a almost a mortality piece to it too that I appreciate after being in the outdoors. Like it's like healthy. It's not like you know, doing risky things for the sake of it, but it reminds me of just how human I am. And that's the temperance of it all, maybe.
Hmm.
Um, you talked about how the wildlife has, been here older than many of the humans. One of the things I felt, and have felt in a few different spaces in the American West, I've certainly spent some time in New England and Appalachia, but I love the American West. But there are some places where where they feel, I don't know, spiritually powerful, potent, than others. For me, one of those places was in the Black Hills. I remember thinking that I was like, the old gods have been here, and I don't know what that means or what that looks like. I don't even know what I just said, but I just know that something old has walked these lands, and you can feel it. Um, did you feel that sense of interconnectedness as you were traveling, as you were researching, or even as you were making these relationships with those that you interviewed?
that feeling happens all the time. You know, it's not something that happened. It happens all the time. And the most recent profound one was in your neck of the woods. I was invited by um, the Native American Education Department at Great Falls Public Schools last February to be like the artist in residence. So I spent 3 days talking to high school classes, and then they said, we're going to do a bison harvest the day after you leave. Do you want to stay an extra day and join us for this? And I said, yes, I've never done one before. So we went out to the Front Range and arranged to kill a bison. And it was a very, very beautifully bright sunny day, but it was like 10 below zero when we were out there. So it was all of these perfect northern plains conditions. And, you know, just to shorten the story a little bit, I know we're starting to run low on time here, but I ended up um, holding the heart of this buffalo that had just been killed while the heart is still warm. And I tasted some of the blood, you know, as we would traditionally do. And, you know, I have to say, you know, and that it wasn't the biggest, certainly not the biggest buffalo I've ever seen. But the heart was this big, you know, it was huge. And again, just to be a little more brief than I normally would be telling this story, that was one of those moments. That was those moments where I felt more connected to these countless generations of buffalo hunters, which my people were and were very, very good at it. My connection to them, but also the connection to all of the ancestors of this buffalo and what they meant to our people and what our relationship has meant to that place for thousands of years. You know, you can do aerial photography of the central Montana, and you can see signs where the landscape has been shaped by all of those hooves that for thousands of years would migrate from the north all the way to the Missouri River, to the Yellowstone, and down to the south and up along the Front Range of the Rockies, right through what's today is Choteau and Depouillier and all of those places. And it just happened over and over and over again. And here I am in the shadow of those same mountains, holding this warm heart. It was profound. And I think that's an example of what you're asking me about. It happens all the time. I think the more you open yourself up to it, the more it happens. I think the coincidence of the date of my first book coming out and me kind of being birthed into the world as this storyteller that people seem to want to invite to come and talk to them, and that then coincidence of the poet laureateship being appointed onto me, you know, on the same date, but 5 years later. Those are all things I think were doors have opened for me that never should have been if it wasn't for the hands of my ancestors kind of guiding me. You know, I never went to school. I've never taken any writing classes or any poetry classes or any of that stuff. I have a high school diploma. I was going to be a rock star, you know, and that didn't work out. And I just kept writing, and here we are. And it's certainly nothing I did all on my own.
Yeah. Well, that is so powerful, and thank you for that.
Hmm.
The story not only of the buffalo heart, but the ancestral trust, that feeling you have of of being connected to so much more than just being alone in this world, and I think that's very powerful. Um,
That was
and
one of
also,
that was one of the things with becoming Little Shell that I mention in the book, and I've literally just had this realization just now talking to you is, you know, the desire to want to be part of something bigger and just be a part of something, and I'd never felt part of anything. And becoming, you know, my application for enrollment with the Little Shell being accepted, I thought that was going to be that thing that felt part of something bigger. But I have kind of a conflicted relationship with what it means to be Little Shell. So that wholeness has not been achieved. Where I feel connected is to that wider connection to just indigeneity and that multicultural, multi-tribal, intertribal across the northern plains and all of our older than human relatives. That's the connection I feel. That's the something bigger that I feel that I never felt before in my life. And you might call that faith, you might call it spirituality, but to actually be able to define it and actually be able to look and see these are the relationships we had, and they are tenuous in our modern day, and we need to return to a strong relationship with those. That's the connection I feel that was lacking, I think.
Well, and one of the ways that you also feel connected and feel supported, as you said, we're running out of time, but, was your dog Darla. And you have had many dogs in the past, but one of the you talk about is, the sacred art of dog walking, which comes from the sacred art of log sitting, but it's just the appreciation, it's the sacred duty and the honor of walking your dog. Can you talk about your relationship with dogs and the role that they play in your life?
Yeah, so the sacred art of log sitting was a poem from Jim Harrison's last book before he died, last book of poetry before he died, Dead Man's Float. And I had a real connection to that. And, he was a big dog guy also. And I think in that particular poem, he talks about his dog Zilpha, who also dies. And Darla was kind of my companion that I spent a lot of time with when I was working through just a profound amount of grief after my father passed away, and just the state of my life. I was 100 pounds almost heavier than I am now. I was just unhealthy, both physically and emotionally, and just all of those things. And we'd lost a bunch of pets from the household also. Darla was I think it was her and a cat out of six pets, so we just started going on these walks. And, I realized that, she was kind of like, the need to take her out was also a need I had that I didn't realize until I was out doing it. And, these companions we have, they're family, and they're big parts of our lives. And it's something that I think connects us. It's a way for us, like, my neighbors, I know their dogs' names, but I don't necessarily know my neighbors' names. I just passed
Well,
one
even
I just passed one rushing back to get here in time to do our discussion, and had to stop so that Grin, the little shit rat, could growl at me like he always does, but I don't know, the woman who shares the house with him. I can't always remember her name. But so, yeah, there's just something about our relationship that we have that I think speaks to the relationship that we had with the entire world at one point. And if there's, to me, any hope that we can return to that, it's just how important our horses and dogs and cats can be to all of us. And that, to me, is a seed to what the future could be.
absolutely. And I mean, that passage in your book I mean, it's haunted me in the middle of the winter in Montana, Chris, where I'll be like, no, it's too cold. I don't want to take my dog on a walk. I'm like, but Chris said, it's a sacred art,
Yeah,
and
it
that it's an
is.
honor to do this for your dog, but for yourself. There's an honor in taking care of these and being in relate of having these animals. Like, I get to do this for my dog. I
Hmm.
get to take care of you, and
Right.
it was just so beautifully worded. And you laugh about not knowing your neighbors' names, like, as you were I was like, "That's so funny," because I knew Darla's name, but I did not remember if it was his grandfather's funeral or if it was his mom who
Right.
was Catholic, but I knew
Uh-huh.
his dog's name, and
That's
it's
right.
just like,
That's right.
there's little it's just yeah. They teach us unconditional love. They teach us being seen. Someone joked the other day that I take my dog with me everywhere as a service dog. They're like, "Oh, I bet you wish he could talk." And I was like, "Oh, he knows too much. I don't know."
Huh?
Actually, if I do want him to talk, I think he's perfect the way he is, actually. Sign some NDAs or something.
Uh-huh.
So, Chris, what is next for you? And where can folks follow you to keep up with all that you're doing and to learn more?
Well, the best way to keep up with what I'm doing is probably my newsletter, An Irritable Métis, which is on Substack currently. I'm hoping to move it off there or here in the next year or so, but that's where it is now. It's the only, I don't have any social media or anything like that. So my newsletter is the place. I feel like I actually started my next book of nonfiction last night because I started the bibliography because that was one of the last things I did for becoming Little Shell, and it was a struggle going back through to make a list of the books. So the ones that I've been, getting ideas from and pulling quotes from and stuff that may or may not end up in the book at all anyway. I've been keeping track of them as I go. So I actually took the bibliography from, you know, becoming Little Shell and just repurposed it to start putting new books into it for this one. So I guess that means I have actually started it now. Poetry, I've got another manuscript that should be out this summer, small press type thing. But the big thing is a couple friends of mine and I last year debuted this indigenous festival called Indigipalooza. I'm wearing the t-shirt right now.
You are, yeah.
Indigipalooza, Montana. So last year was a celebration of Native storytelling, and we had Joy Harjo as our keynote headliner. She's the first Native poet laureate in the history of U.S. poet laureates. So she was the U.S. poet laureate, and it was dedicated to just all the ways that Indigenous people still tell stories. So we had poets and writers, but we also had musicians. We had music there, and we had a cooking demo. Mariah Gladstone came down. So, because that's kind of storytelling also. So that was the theme last year, and it was great. It was in Missoula, it was at the public library. And then we said, well, let's do it again. So this year we're doing it, and the theme is Resistance 250 plus. So it's not a literary festival at all, though we have some writers coming. Our keynote this year is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who
Oh,
wrote
wow.
Braiding Sweetgrass. And we have some other Native writers, but then we have people working like in buffalo restoration on reservations. And we have a panel
Wow.
devoted to, Indigenous joy and well-being and, the re-empowerment of women with, because of things like MMIW and all of that. So it's this broad celebration of all these different things that are happening today, things that Native people are doing today to allow us to thrive in the wake of this 250 plus year effort to eliminate us. And so that's July 31st and August 1st in Missoula. And one of my favorite things is there's this indigenous punk rock band from Denver called Dead Pioneers. They're going to come and play a show also, and I'm pretty jacked about that. So yeah, it's going to be cool.
That
So if
is
you're in
cool.
Montana, you should definitely come. Everything's free.
Oh, yeah. I'm happy to promote anything
Yeah.
for you guys leading up to it. Let's stay in chat. That's really cool and
Hmm.
fantastic about the keynote speakers on both accounts for your
Yeah.
first and second year. You knocked it out of the park.
Yeah. Joy was kind of a reach, but uh, Robin and I share a speaking agent, and we've interacted, done a couple events together in the past. So that was more of a, we had a pretty good feeling that we were going to be able to have Robin come. So
Uh,
Joy was one of those, was kind of like a cold call, and she was into it. But this
that's
year
it.
it's a little different, and I'm really excited about the folks that we're having come.
Certainly. Well, you're doing so much for so many people. I am appreciative that you came by today. I do hope that you will return so we can do a deeper dive on any of the numerous things we covered today. I know today was kind of a flyover skim of just trying to get to know you a little bit and introduce you to my audiences, but you're a powerful writer, very descriptive storyteller that tells things with passion and what I would call like respectful passion. Like the emotional intensity's there, but you don't sound propagandic or, some of those other phrases that I think passionate people can sometimes veer into. And I really I cried, I laughed, I've highlighted, and folks who can't see if you're listening audio, but I tabbed up his books. Like there's a lot of
That's
quotables in
beautiful.
there.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for writing it. It's just, um, because and one thing we didn't get to, folks, that we will at some point is his one sentence journal. It's a book of short poems and essays from the world at large, is what the subtitle is. But again, based on this writing practice of just one sentence a day,
Hmm.
and how much you can really capture in one sentence, and what a lesson on brevity and detail at the same time. I don't. It's beautiful. But, Chris, is there anything else that you wanna say before we wrap up?
I think that should do it.
Alrighty. Well, folks, that was another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson, and that was poet and author Chris Latre. You can find him, The Irritable Métis, over on Substack. Tell me, what did you think about this conversation? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. You guys know the drill. And until next time, I'm Lee Larson. This is Follow the Leader. See ya.